Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the morality of mechanical minds. So I think we all know, or we all assume, that robots are going to take an increasingly bigger role in human life. So this is estimates by the United Nations that at 2022, this is already old, perhaps like 58% of the jobs will be taken. Still, the majority of jobs will be performed by humans, but then by 2025, which is already close, they're assuming that majority of tasks and jobs will already will happen, will be done by robots. In my talk today, I'm going to talk about two specific questions that my research deals with about the role that we want, or the role that robots will have in our lives. The first question is, do people want machines to make moral decisions, right? So one type of action, one type of task that the machines can do, that robots can do, are morally relevant. And the question that we should ask as a society is, do we actually want them to make these types of decisions? And the second part of the talk would be about, okay, so let's assume that they do make decisions, do act as decision makers, as decision makers in the moral domain. How would people respond to their actions? And I will argue that the answer to both of these questions depends on how people perceive the minds of robots. And I'm saying robots, I don't really make a huge distinction here between embodied robots and virtual algorithms. For me, it's all artificial minds or artificial agents. So I'm not making any distinction between them in my talk today. I'm going to talk about two different aspects of mind that I think affect how people respond to robots or think about robots. And for these questions, the first is whether or not robots have agency and experience. And the second is whether or how people perceive the motivation of robots. So the first question is about agency and experience. So one of the big theories in mind perception talks about people perceiving the mind of others on two distinct domains. One domain is the domain of agency meaning the ability of an agent to, or of a target, to think, plan, and do. And the other domain, the other dimension is the dimension of experience, and that's the ability to experience also physical experiences such as pain and hunger, but also emotional experiences such as happiness, sadness, etc. And prior work on mind perception found that people perceive robots as having both lacking experience and lacking mind in comparison to humans. And I will argue that when we people think about what type of mind we want decision makers that make decisions in the moral domain to have, we want them to have both experience and agency. That's the premise of the first part of the talk. And this is based on a paper published in 2018 in Cognition. It's a journal in psychology, together with Kurt Gray, who was my postdoc advisor at UNC. So in the paper we have a bunch of studies. The first study is to see, in the first study we wanted to see whether people think it's okay for machines to make moral decisions. So we told them a story, we told them, okay, self-driving cars are coming, and sometimes they might need to make decisions of life and death. And these decisions can affect, of course, the people in the car, but they can also affect pedestrians and people in other cars. And then we randomly assigned participants to one of two conditions. So some participants read that for a new car model, a human driver would be the one to make these decisions, and that's like the regular car that we all know. But some participants read that for a new self-driving car model, an autonomous computer program will be the one to make these types of decisions. So some of the participants read about a human making these life and death decisions, and some participants read about an algorithm basically making this type of life and death decisions. And then I asked participants how permissible, how okay they thought it was for the agent that they read about to be the one making these types of decisions. So these are just sampling, these are the items they used, right? So for example, To what extent do you agree that it's appropriate for autonomous computer program to be the one making these decisions? An autonomous computer program should be the one to make these decisions. And an autonomous computer programs should be forbidden from making these types of decisions. This was a reversed scored item. And these are the results that we got. So here on the y-axis, you can see ratings of permissibility. So the higher the rating, the more permissible people thought it was for that agent that they read about, right? Half participants read about a human, and half the participants read about an algorithm or a machine. How permissible they thought it was for that agent to make that decision. And you can see that people generally thought it's more permissible for a human than for an algorithm or robot to make these types of decisions in the context of a self-driving car that sometimes might need to make life and death decisions. So that's initial support for my argument that people generally are not really happy with algorithms making life and death decisions. I tested this in a bunch of other contexts, right? So the first context was the context of a self-driving car. A second context, the context of parole decisions. So we know there's actually an algorithm that was used in a company in the United States to help parole boards decide about parole decisions. So that's why we use this. That's why we use this example. Another context we tested is the context of medical decision making. So another field where automatization and the use of algorithms is becoming more prevalent is the context of medical decision making. So that's why we used this in another study. And then finally, one big topic of discussion in the field of robot ethics is the question of autonomous lethal weapons, where you have theoretically a weapon system that can identify a target and decide to launch a missile at the target without any human intervention. So we use the context of a military drone that decides to shoot at a terrorist at the risk of harming innocent civilians, also to see if people think it's permissible or not permissible for an algorithm to make that type of decision. And in all of these contexts, we found very similar results. So we find that people consistently think it's more permissible for a human agent to be the one making these decisions than for an algorithm to be the one making these decisions. I do want to note that some decisions people generally were not really happy with anybody making, right? So you can see that for the drone scenario, right, of shooting a missile at a known terrorist at the risk of harming innocent civilians, even people are not very happy with humans making that type of decision either. Decisions about whether or not to perform a risky surgery. I'll get into more details about that in a few minutes. Also, people are not happy with anybody making that type of decision, but generally we see people find it less permissible for an algorithm or a machine to make this decision than for a human. So that's the basic finding. Generally, you can say, yeah, people do not want machines making moral decisions. That's the first part of the argument. And then the question is why? So as I mentioned before, I think that one explanation would be that that we humans, we people, we want moral agents to have both agency and experience. We want them also to be able to think, plan, and do, to think rationally about things and analyze them and implement plans properly. But we also want those who make more decisions to have experience, to be able to experience emotions, for example, or experience pain, right? So if we're talking about these types of decisions, they inflict pain, physical or emotional pain on others, and we might want those who make these decisions to at least be able to emphasize with the consequences of what they're doing. So I tested this in another study. I taught participants a story about risky surgery. So there's a child who's been in a very bad car accident, and if we do nothing, he will be paralyzed for life, and he won't be able to move his arms or feet. But there's a risky surgery that we can do that might save him from paralysis, but there's a certain likelihood that he will die during the surgery. And then we taught participants about a human doctor or an algorithm that decided to perform the surgery. And we asked them the same questions we asked them before about permissibility, how permissible they thought it was for that agent that they read about to be the one making the decision. But we also asked them about how they perceive the agency and the experience of the agent that they read about, of the human doctor or the robot doctor. So we measured agency by asking them how much they think that agent can communicate with others, is able of thinking and can plan its actions. And for experience, to what extent do we think they can experience fear, happiness, so a negative and a positive emotion, and experience physical pain. And these are the results for mind perception. So here on the y-axis, we see mind perception. So the higher the ranking is, the more participants saw that agent that they read about is having that type of mind. So you can set both for agency and experience. People see humans as having more of that type of mind than the algorithm. I see if something here is not working with the so the blue column is the human. So people see humans as pretty high in both agency and experience, and people see robots as having medium levels of agency and very low levels of experience. I then tested whether this lack of mind, lack in both agency and experience, can statistically explain people's aversion from the algorithm making this decision. And this is what I found. So I found that people perceive the algorithm as having this agency and this experience than the human. And the more agency and the more experience that the agent was perceived as having, the more permissible permissible participants thought it was for that agent to be the one making these types of decisions. So this is an additional support for my hypothesis, right? So we saw that people do not want machines to make these decisions. And at least statistically, this can be explained by the fact that machines or algorithms are seen as lacking in both agency and experience, right? So people do not want machines making more decisions because machines lack mind. Or in other words, because people perceive machines as having less of a mind than humans. And mind perception, agency, and experience are important for us. It's important for us that those that make more decisions will have those abilities. In this paper, I also looked at some qualifiers. Some qualifiers, one of them is what happens if the algorithm is actually better at decisions than the human. So it's easy to manipulate in the context of medical decision making. We can say, oh, the algorithm actually has a higher success rate than the human. And we find that when the advantage of using an algorithm for the quality of a decision making is high, it's prevalent, so people are more willing to accept the algorithm as a decision maker. We also looked at what happens when we increase the experience of an algorithm, right? So we can describe the algorithm where the robot is actually having high experience. And unfortunately, results for this type of manipulation were not super successful. So we did find the indirect effect. So when robots were presented as having more experience, people thought, oh, they're having more experience and therefore we're perhaps more willing to accept them as more decision makers. But we had the main effect working in the other direction. So there might be something else going on there. It's in the paper and I'm happy to talk about it more. So we tried doing that. It was not super fruitful. But then another thing to look at is what happens if there's actually a benefit to using algorithm, right? So one of the main incentives companies and society has to use algorithms instead of humans is that algorithms can work at scale and they're cheaper than humans. So what happens if we replace humans with algorithms, we save a lot of money and we can use the money to do other good things. So I just ran through this study pretty fast. So looked again at a hospital scenario and we said, okay, we have a hospital and the hospital needs to decide who will be the one to make these types of decisions. Dr. Jones, which is a human, or HealthPrompt, which is a robot. I was not very creative with the name of the robots in these studies. And then we told participants that using HealthPrompt will allow the hospital to afford more beds and provide care for more patients, right? So we can be Puritans and use humans, but if we do that, we will actually pay a price in human life, or in human well-being, because we will be able to take care of this people. So then they ask participants, okay, so assuming that using HealthCamp and using Dr. Jones costs the same, who do you want to be the one making the decisions? What happens if using HealthCamp saves the hospital enough money so they can afford 1 new bed or 5 new beds or 10, 50, 100, 500, and 1,000 new beds. So I ask participants to rate their answer for each of these. Who do they want? Who do they think should be the one to make the decisions? And that can show us whether people are sensitive to the benefit of using algorithms for these types of decisions. And these are the results. So here on the y-axis, we see the number of participants, or the percentage of participants that chose the human as a decision maker. And then the x-axis, we'll see the number of bids, which is basically how much of a benefit society can get from using the algorithm for this type of decision. And these are the results. So when there's no advantage to use the algorithm, people generally prefer the human, but people are sensitive to numbers. So the more society can benefit from using algorithms, the more people are willing to accept the algorithm in that role, even if it means that an algorithm, again, that they do not want to be the one to make these decisions, is making them. Another cute aspect of the study is we ask participants why, to justify results. I forgot to say, so, but we see we have like a pretty strong opposition, right? So I think around 30 or more percent of participants said even if we can save, even if using the algorithm can allow the hospital can provide the hospital with enough funds for 1,000 new beds, taking care of more patients, even in that case, we don't want an algorithm to be the one making the decisions. And we ask them why. This is an open-ended question, and then this is some results that we got. So people say that human emotion, compassion, and spirit is an important part of healthcare, and human decision-making is necessary when in regards to human life. So this is not statistics, but this kind of supports the main gist of our argument. People think that human decision makers that have experience humans that have experience should be the ones to be making these types of decisions. So we saw for this part of the talk that people do not want machines making moral decisions because they lack mind, and that both agency and experience are important for moral decision making. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about, so we talked about perceived mind, about agency and experience. And the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk about motivation, how people perceive the motivation of robots and how that might affect the way they judge robots' behavior. And specifically, I'm going to look at how the perceived motivation of robots affects people's reactions to discrimination. And this is a paper that came out in 2022 together with a bunch of other collaborators. So we know that there's discrimination in society, unfortunately. There's discrimination based on race, on age, race, gender, and age. All of these types of discrimination are prohibited in most Western countries. And unfortunately, they're still kind of prevalent. And now when we talk about discrimination, we need to distinguish between two different meanings of the word. One of them is just the action of discriminating between two differentiating between two different stimuli, which is the meaning usually used in computer science. But then in the social sciences, when we talk about discrimination, we usually talk about an action of distinguishing between two different types of stimuli, but this is together with kind of a negative judgment, right? So like a prejudiced or a prejudicial outlook, action, or treatment. So we're not only distinguishing between people, we're mistreating people according to their belonging, their demographics, or whether or not they belong to a specific group. So we have discrimination. It's bad, right? So the question we need to ask as a society is like, okay, so why do we have discrimination? What's the reason? And the unfortunate answer is people. People are biased, people have prejudice, and people discriminate. So one solution for the problem of discrimination is instead of having people making decisions, we can have robots or algorithms making decisions, and we can program these robots to be better than we are. And if, for example, we know that people are biased against certain groups, we can program the algorithms in a way that they will treat people fairly and ignore demographic features. Well, that at least was a promise. And then the use of algorithms for certain types of decisions, they offer added value for companies in other aspects, right? So one of them is algorithms can be less biased than humans. The other one is that algorithms can be cheaper than humans, right? If we can automatize some aspects of some actions, some of the processes in our company, it would be cheaper. And algorithms might be making a better job. Algorithms might be making better decisions than humans are, right? Which of course goes with them being less biased. But unfortunately, as we today know, algorithms, even if statistically speaking, perhaps algorithms are less discriminatory than humans, or discriminate less than humans, there are still many cases where algorithms do discriminate. So here are just a few examples. Amazon, this is already old news, but in 2014, Amazon started using an AI tool for screening applicants for software engineering for programming and software engineering positions. And they scrapped it after a year and a half, I think, because it turned out that it was systematically biased against women. So that's one example. Another example is a Apple Card, which it seems, I think that there's more evidence out there now that it's been systematically also biased against women, giving men higher credit limits than it gives women. So these are just two examples. When we think about discrimination, so it's important to look at the response to discrimination. So one response to discrimination is there's moral outrage. When we see discrimination, we are morally outraged, it might motivate us to punish the wrongdoers, and it might motivate us into collective action to try and fix the problem or prevent future discrimination. So the question that we're asking here is whether or not people will be more equally, how would discrimination by an algorithm affect people's moral outrage at the discrimination? And to answer this question, we need to think, what are the reasons that people are morally outraged at discrimination? And there are two types of answers that we can provide for this. The first is the outcome, right? You can say people are morally outraged when they hear about discrimination because of the outcome, because discrimination is a negative outcome. When there's discrimination, so people don't get the job opportunities that they deserve, people get a lower credit limit, people spend more time in jail. All these bad things happen. But these bad things happen regardless of if they're performed by a human or by an algorithm. So if the only reason why people are morally outraged by a discrimination is because of the outcome, we would not expect to see any difference between discrimination by a human and discrimination by an algorithm. However, another reason why people might be morally outraged at discrimination is that when we see somebody discriminate, it says something about the motivation. It says something about the type of person that they are. In other words, we might be morally outraged because we think that the discriminating agent is prejudiced. And then when we talk about discrimination, there are basically two types of attributions or perceptions that people might make of the discriminatory agent. One of them is that they're prejudiced. And then the other one is that it's data. And now some of us might think that it's never data, it's always prejudice, but some people believe that there are inherent differences between groups and that discrimination sometimes just reflects that inherent differences. I personally disagree, but that's an attribution that people make. I want to argue that people find it easier, or people attribute more prejudice to a human decision maker than to an algorithm. And on the other hand, when people hear about an algorithm that discriminates, they might say, oh, this is actually data-driven, right? This is not because of prejudice. The algorithm is not prejudiced against any group. This is just based on data. And if it's based on data, right, if it's not because of prejudice, people might be less morally outraged. So the second part of the argument here is that if the perception of prejudice or the attribution of prejudice also affects moral outrage, so we will expect people to be less morally outraged when they hear about discrimination by an algorithm, because they will think that the algorithm is less prejudiced than the human. So these are the two hypotheses. The first is that people perceive the algorithms as less prejudiced than humans. And the second is because they're perceived as less prejudiced, people will be less morally outraged. So the first study, I looked at attributions of prejudice. Okay, so participants read about either discrimination by a human or discrimination by an algorithm, and I used the basic case of the Amazon discriminatory algorithm. I eventually used a different name because I didn't want to get into any legal problems with Amazon lawyers. But participants read a story about a high-tech company that hires almost no women, and they were told that the hiring process has two phases. The first phase, there's a screening phase, and the second phase, there's a hiring committee. And it turns out that women did not pass the screening part, and then half of the participants read that this is because a human screener was discriminated against women, and half of the participants read that an algorithm screener discriminated against women. And then we asked them how prejudiced or how sexist the agent, the algorithm, or the human was, how objective they thought that agent was, and how much discrimination they think actually happened. And these are the results. So here on the y-axis we see the ratings. The full bar is the algorithm, and the empty bar would be humans. So we see people perceive humans as more motivated by prejudice, more sexist than algorithms are. People see algorithms as more objective than the humans, and people see when an algorithm does it, it's less of a discrimination than when a human does it. So this is the first part of my hypothesis here, is that people perceive algorithms as less prejudiced than humans. In the second study, I wanted to see if that affects moral outrage. So I used, again, the same basic scenario. Participants read about either discrimination by a human or discrimination by an algorithm. And then I measured sexist perceptions of sexist motivation, and I also measured moral outrage, how angry they are at the discriminatory actions of the agent. And these are the results. So generally, people were less morally outraged at algorithm discrimination than human discrimination. And statistically, this is mediated by the fact that people perceive the algorithm as less motivated by prejudice. And the more an agent was motivated by prejudice, the more morally outraged people were. So what we see here is we see that people are morally outraged not only because of the outcome, but also because of the motivation they attribute to the agent, to the discriminatory agent. And people perceive algorithms as less discriminatory than, is less prejudiced than humans, leading them to be less morally outraged. And I replicated this basic finding of people being less morally outraged at algorithm discrimination for discrimination based on race, discrimination based on age, discrimination based on gender, which we did in 3 different samples, also a regular sample, also a representative sample, and also a sample of tech workers from Norway. And these are the results that we got in out of these replications. So we can see, again, kind of consistently, people, the first thing to say is that people are generally kind of morally outraged when they hear about discrimination. People do not think it's okay. People are angry at this, but consistently and systematically, people are less morally outraged when it's an algorithm than when it's a human. So we see that people are less outraged at algorithm discrimination, and this is mediated by perceived prejudice. So again, algorithms are perceived as prejudiced, more data-driven, and therefore people are less morally outraged when they do discriminate. I have a bunch of other studies. I'll run through them pretty fast so we can have some time for Q&A at the end. So I looked also at outrage at the company. So just in a nutshell, what we see here is that people are more morally outraged at the company for just using algorithms for these types of decisions. But this difference between how angry they are at the company for using the algorithms. So this penalty the company gets for using an algorithm kind of disappears when you hear about discrimination. So the effect of discrimination at moral outrage at the company, this is not on the action, this is at the company, the penalty for the company for using an algorithm is lower than for using a human. So discrimination by an algorithm increases moral outrage less than discrimination by a human, and this is outraged at the company. Another interesting finding here is what happens if the algorithms does not discriminate, because the whole promise of algorithms is that they won't discriminate. They will actually perhaps reduce discrimination. And we see that companies so in the same way that people are less angry at a company when it uses algorithms to reduce discrimination, people are less happy with a company when it uses an algorithm to reduce discrimination. So people prefer, a company will be evaluated more positively if it uses humans to fix discrimination than if it uses an algorithm. So again, these are the key findings. People perceive algorithms as less prejudiced than humans are, and this leads them to be less morally outraged. So the two kind of things we saw today is the first one was, should machines make more decisions? And the answer is, I think, no, people do not want machines to make more decisions. But when machines do make more decisions, people are less upset than if humans make more decisions. And again, I looked at the subtype of more decisions, and the subtype of discrimination. Of course, for other outcomes, other types of decisions, the results might be a bit different. And I also argued that both of these are kind of depending on how people perceive the minds of these artificial agents, of these algorithms or robots. So people are averse towards robots making these decisions, but they're also more forgiving. And another thing I think it's important for us to know as a society is that people are less sensitive to algorithm discrimination. And I think that's important because one of the safeguards we have against discrimination is moral outrage. And if we aren't sensitive to discrimination, we won't be able to solve it. So the fact that people might be less sensitive and they might be less aware of the fact that algorithms do discriminate might be a danger for us as a society that strives to be just. And as I mentioned before, right, so all of these kind of hinge on the fact that people perceive algorithms differently than humans, having less of a mind, less agency and less experience, and also having less of a prejudiced motivation. So the two big questions I think we can think about is, what should algorithms be allowed to do? What do we as humans, what type of decisions do we think algorithms should be allowed to do? And what we need to do to mitigate the harm from algorithm decision-making. Yeah, so that's all for today, and I'm happy to spend the rest of the time that we have for discussions.